John can see it.
Use your whatever graphics stuff to do right on the
It's lunch. Aren't you supposed to go and your whatever you do?
It's at 4.
It's at 4. So you're missing my class and you're not missing Tyler. Okay, I get it. I'm just giving you a hard time.
A lot of hydrogen.
We see for the soda, that was my problem. Hey, how's it going? Not how, but just like how. She doesn't know how to study. She just gets it. I don't
Very practical. Hey, Jin. Are you in this class or this is fun?
No, well, I took Dr. Milko.
Things to be able to say.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Doe. I'm Senior Associate Dean at the Business School for Research, Faculty, and Global Engagement. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today. At the Business School, we are very interested in research that has societal impact. So interested that we actually produce this cool brochure, which we have some of out front for you to collect. And it's something that we take seriously, and so do a lot of our stakeholders, including our accreditor, the Association for Collegiate Schools of Business. We define social impact or societal impact quite broadly, and you're going to get one angle on it here from Tyler. Tyler Milfeld is the Michelle Trainer 91 Assistant Professor of Marketing at Villanova. He earned his PhD from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, his MBA from the University of Texas at Austin, BA from Northwestern University. He specializes in brand communication, corporate social responsibility, message framing, and linguistics. His research has been published in the field's leading journals such as the Journal of Advertising Research, Journal of Advertising, and International Journal of Advertising. One of his initial projects was a collaboration with Dave's Killer Bread on introducing their purpose, second chance employment to consumers. Dr. Milfeld proposed that framing support for ex-offenders around a positive shared idea could shift attitudes towards this stigmatized group. The campaign exceeded all forecast metrics, and the resulting paper, A Fresh Start for Stigmatized Groups, The Effect of Cultural Identity Mindset Framing in Brand Advertising, won the Journal of Advertising's Best Article of the Year Award in 2021. So I am really honored and excited to introduce Tyler Milfeld here today.
So thank you, Jonathan. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out in the snow. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us here at the Pelby Library. So my name is Tyler Milfeld. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first, and then we'll get into the fun stuff related to green advertising. So a little bit about me. Before I turned the academic route, as I worked in marketing for 13 years. I worked at the Hershey Company, worked at Colgate-Palmolive, among some other entities, and loved my time in marketing. And this was actually my last day at the Hershey Company as I walked out and the sun was setting. It was a very seminal moment. But a lot of my research was inspired by my time at the Hershey Company. So what's interesting is when I was on the marketing team, we would talk a lot about some of the great works that the Hershey Company does. The Hershey Company does really great things in the corporate social responsibility sphere, through the Milton Hershey School, through some of its environmental initiatives. And we as a brand team would often have these meetings to talk about if we actually wanted to talk about it or advertise it. And the conversation really boiled down to a lot of reticence from the marketing organization to have that conversation with consumers, based on a couple things. It was based on the fact that we, as a Hershey Company and the Hershey brand, had a reputation kind of in the product space that we wanted to preserve. We wanted that to be really salient. We were never quite sure what we wanted to say, so if we were going to say something, what would we actually say? And then the other question was, who would we actually say it to? Would our consumers actually be interested in this stuff, or would there be a certain group of consumers that would be more interested? And if you think about that as our framework for today, you think about there's a message source, so it comes from certain brand, and that brand has a reputation. Think about the message itself, so what you're actually going to say. Then you think about the consumer characteristics, and that all influences what makes a message effective. So we'll start with a couple quick warm-up questions and get the audience involved a little bit here. So how many marketing messages, on average, do you see a day? How many marketing messages? Ashley, yes.
Like at least 1,000.
At least 1,000. So we've got at least 1,000 over here. We have another guess. Now we want to go higher.
Yeah.
We want to go higher. We want to go lower. What do you think?
I was gonna have, but I just look at trees all day. Maybe 200.
Maybe 200. So you have 200, 1,000. Take one more. Yes. 3,000. 3,000. So you're actually on the low end of things. It's 10,000. Count them, 10,000. When you think about marketing messages, they come in a variety of different forms. So if you're wearing a Villanova sweatshirt, like you see a couple of them here, like that itself is a marketing message. It's a logo that sends a particular message. You see a Villanova hat back there. You have a water bottle with a logo on it. That sends a message. You're driving around in your car. You see different bumper stickers. You see different logos on cars. So those are all marketing messages. You're exposed to a lot of them. And one of the biggest challenges from a marketer's perspective is how do you cut through the clutter? How do you actually become more resonant with consumers? So what actually makes a message effective? We're coming off the Super Bowl. Go Eagles, of course. But I was most interested in the ads, being the marketer at heart. So being the marketer at heart, so I'm sure many of you also watched an ads. What makes an ad particularly effective for you? What makes an ad particularly effective? Let's go to the back, to Grace.
Like being able to remember it.
Being able to remember it, right? So something that can stick in your mind, and then ideally from a marketing standpoint, you remember it when you're about ready to make a purchase, right? When you're at that point of decision. What else? Yes?
Like evoking emotions, whether like good or bad.
Yeah, it evokes emotion, creates some feeling that can also be implanted in your mind. Yes?
It creates conversation with others.
Creates conversation with others, right? So it sparks some interest in that community, gets people talking about it. So those are all things that factor in. There's a myriad of factors. Today, we're going to focus on the three that I mentioned at the outset here. So think about it, when you're sending a text or you're sending an email or something, you as a sender have a certain reputation, right? There are certain things that the message receiver knows about you that help to inform whether the message is credible and the tone of the message and all those things. So as a sender, you're then sending a message. You're typing a message, you're writing a message, whatever that is, and the person will then interpret based on what they know about you, based on the message and how you write it, and kind of put that into a context. And then there's, of course, the message receiver. So the person who receives the message, certain characteristics about that particular person, right, that may make that person more or less resonant to a particular message. So my research, before we get into the fun green advertising stuff, generally focuses on what's called the corporate social responsibility or pro-social sphere. I have several research corridors that I focus on. So one is related to brand activism, which is something really popular in the last couple of years, where brands take a stand on a societal issue and a socio-political issue. So one of the projects that my colleagues and I worked on was related to the reputation of the brand, and how a brand like Ben & Jerry's that has a reputation for activism is perceived to be more credible when it actually has a message versus another brand in that particular space. And for people who are most knowledgeable about that particular issue, they tend to punish brands who don't have a reputation. There's a really interesting relationship there. But another project that is just about to be published, just about to make its debut, that relates to how brands actually, once they take a stand, how they respond to backlash from brand activism. And a little peek under the tent for that one is that when brands actually retract, it could be a brand, an influencer, when they actually retract their stance, that is the least optimal position, or generates the least optimal response, versus saying nothing at all, or just taking responsibility for it. So there's really interesting dynamics about the message. Also work kind of in the more more social impact sphere, some of the less controversial stuff, when you move away from brand activism. One of my former research assistants here at Villanova just finished this project. It was a really cool project about wellness surcharges. Have any of you been to a restaurant where at the bottom of the bill you see something, as you see on the middle screen there, it's called a wellness surcharge? Anybody seen one of those? They've been pretty popular here in the Philly. I see some nods over there. It's usually like a 3, 4, 5, 6% surcharge. And what we found through that particular project is that the more dominant or the bigger the message source and the reputation of that message source, the angrier consumers would actually get. So the source has a lot of impact. But today, we're going to focus exclusively on kind of green advertising. What makes a green advertising message effective? It's a lot of the same ingredients that actually make another message effective. So when you think about green advertising over here, there are a lot of different green ads that you're exposed to. So green ads can focus on a product, like you see on the far left-hand side. There are certain elements of this particular product that make it more green. It could be packaging, it could be ingredients, it could be a lot of those different pieces. There are ads that encourage you to be more eco-friendly and to adopt green behavior. And on the far right, there are ads that really help to promote a company's image in the green space, to help link those two pieces together. So my research, when you look at the green across the right-hand side of the screen, really focuses on those two aspects. So ads that really encourage certain green behaviors or ads that promote a certain image. So we're going to talk about a couple of these projects today. Thought it would be more interesting, instead of going into one project, to provide a top-level overview of some of the interesting findings that my colleagues and I have found along the way. So we're going to talk about 3 of these projects as we go through our discussion. And as we go through our discussion today, it'd be helpful to think about these questions and the questions that really guide a lot of the research that I do. So remember, we're going to focus on the message source. We're going to focus on the actual message, then the message receiver, and the interaction between those various components. So from a message source, one of the big questions we ask is, how does an advertiser's reputation influence how that message is going to be received? We'll talk about reputation and how companies signal their reputation in some really interesting ways. We'll then talk about the way a message is worded. This is one of my favorite areas. You spend enough time with me. I love to think about how different messages are worded and how very subtle changes can impact a message. I was actually on LinkedIn yesterday and saw this great post from someone, from a friend of a friend, who had asked his son to go pick up something at the store. He said, I'd like you to pick up some chips with a pickle with some sour cream. And so his son brought back a bag of chips, a pickle, and sour cream. But what he thought he was asking was a bag of chips with sour cream and pickle flavor, not those individual 3 pieces. Really good example of how kind of messages can be interpreted in different ways, and very subtle changes can impact that stuff. Then we'll look at some different characteristics of the message receiver, specifically in this context about the level of environmental concern. People have different levels of environmental concern. So to give you a little bit of a roadmap, when I go through these 3 projects, we're going to look at some of these characteristics across these 3 projects. And the third one will kind of bring it all together. Have these names for these projects, these shorthand names. We're going to talk about what I call the green tips. We're going to talk about arrogance a little bit. We're going to talk about message framing as we get a little bit deeper into this. So the first project, I have to say, is one of my favorite projects. It's one of my colleagues at the University of Tennessee and his PhD student. And it started by looking at a bunch of social media posts. And we noticed, when we're looking at these social media posts, that whether you're an influencer, whether you're a brand, the companies, particularly around Earth Day, or particularly around different green milestone events, would offer tips on how you can be more green. And we also noticed that some companies offer more tips than others. So if you look on the far left-hand left-hand side of the screen, Airbnb says we have 1 green tip. Then you have Dr. Bronner over here who says we have 5 tips. And then all the way over here with REI, we have 25 tips to click on this link. And that inspired our question, which is, wait a second, how does the number of tips actually influence how it may resonate with consumers and specific types of consumers, right? So 1 tip, should we do 1 tip, should we do 5 tips, should we do 25 tips, should we do 1,000 tips? Does the number of tips actually matter? And we frame this around the fact that people have different levels of environmental concern, right? So on one end of the spectrum, if you think about a scale of 1 to 7 or 1 to 9, at the low end of the spectrum, you have folks who are at the low environmental concern, not particularly engaged with green ads, not particularly engaged with environmental issues, place a lower importance on it, tend to be more skeptical, don't pay a lot of attention to it, and arguably the hardest to motivate and persuade is you think about nudging them to be a little bit more sustainable. Then, of course, if you go all the way to the right side of this spectrum, where you see the dark green over here, you have the high environmental concern. So you ask folks, like, the environment really matters to me. When you ask them about the nature or the state of the environment really concerns me, they're at the far end of the scale across the board. So they often see green ads as relevant. They pay a lot of attention to them. They're really engaged with them. They're more likely to adopt behaviors. So think about that particular spectrum to get a little bit deeper into this project. So we ran a couple of studies, and I'll keep this at a pretty high level and a pretty diverse audience today, but if you ever like to get a little bit deeper into some of the details, happy to discuss any and all of that with you. Let's call this the TIPS project. We set up an experiment. It was an online experiment where my colleague Matthew Pittman, who does a phenomenal job with this, created 2 different sample social media posts. On this side, over here, you see a single tip. So from this company that we created, Axel Mugs, here's a tip: keeping a reusable or eco-friendly mug at work lets you enjoy your coffee. And then here were 3 different tips from the same company. So one group saw this particular post, and another group saw this particular post with those 3 different tips. So we were manipulating 1 versus 3 tips. And it was interesting when we saw our initial results. I'll kind of talk you through a little bit about what you're looking at on the screen here. So the level of environmental concern is on the horizontal axis. So the less concerned you are about the environment, the more you're going to be on the far left. The more concerned about the environment, you're going to be towards the right. And we measured how authentic that particular consumer saw, whether it was 1 tip or 3 tips. So the big takeaway, if you're thinking about this, is on the right side, for folks who are concerned or more concerned about the environment, there's no real difference in authenticity. See, both of them is equally authentic. The interesting stuff really happens on the left side, or in the less environmental concerned consumer. So over here, as you look on that far left, you see 1 tip is perceived to be more authentic than many tips, which leads to a more favorable attitude towards the message source. So this was our first study, and we thought it was really interesting that consumers respond differently, particularly these consumers. Just by adding 2 tips, it creates a very significantly different effect. So we thought about it. We thought about, well, is it the fact that maybe the 3 tips just had a lot more content, it was a lot more to read, and that may just be turning folks away. So we set up a second study and said, okay, instead of listing out the different tips and describing the different environmental behaviors, what we're going to do is just tell you how many tips are a part of this particular enterprise. So we have our 1 tip condition here, we have 10, we have 25. And we thought, okay, let's see if that actually produces a similar result. And interestingly enough, it did. So just remember, as a participant, you were just seeing the number of tips. For the folks who saw one tip, it's the same axis here. Low environmental concern, high environmental concern. There is a little more interesting stuff going on here. But for us, when you look at the low environmental concern, this was a pattern we saw through multiple studies. I won't go through all of them, but this pattern occurred many times, where when you have one tip, the folks who have lower environmental concern tend to perceive it to be more authentic than 10 or 25. That was a pretty significant difference. So we're starting to build this idea that the fewer number of tips may actually be more resonant with folks who are lower environmental concern. The last piece of this puzzle was to actually launch a real study on social media. So we created these different posts here from Pella. We had a control condition that didn't really talk about tips at all. Then we went back to the 1 tips versus the 3 tips to have a little bit more of a stringent test of this particular idea and measured the click-through rate and measured it with low environmental concern consumers. One of the difficulties of this particular enterprise is it's hard when you're targeting on social media to target people who are not interested in something, right? So what we had to do is we had to develop these study these correlations and figure out these correlations with low environmental concern and things that we could actually target or segment that particular audience. So it turns out that those folks were actually more interested in certain financial pieces. They're more interested in like oil, fossil fuels, and that kind of stuff. So we use that as our segmenting proxy. And we measured this stuff. So we looked at reach and impressions to make sure that was a baseline across the board. It was pretty consistent. Measured the cost per click. But what was super interesting is this. So remember, these are the folks who are less concerned about the environment. And that when they saw 1 tip versus just a regular sustainability ad or 3 tips, their click-through rate was higher. And it might not seem like a lot, like 2% versus 3.8%, 3% versus 3.8%. But if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, when you think about a company has millions of dollars, the impact of that 1.8% differential can be massive. So that can be a really massive impact. So what we found in this particular project is that more is essentially not particularly helpful or resonant for folks who are on the lower environmental concern piece of that particular scale. That subtle changes, like just adding a couple of tips, makes a dramatic difference in how people receive these ads. Does anybody have any hypotheses or ideas about why you think the lower environmental consumers preferred 1 tip versus many? Have any ideas, exponential explanations for why that happened? What do you think, Earl?
I mean, my first thought was just like, the more tips you add, the more it looks like greenwashing.
The more, yes. So the more tips you have, the more it may be perceived that the company is trying too hard.
Yeah.
Yep. What else? Yes.
The more tips, it's like more daunting and overwhelming for someone who's not as concerned about the
Yeah,
environment.
more tips can be kind of more daunting, right? If you think about something that you're not particularly interested in, right? And you go and you're someone talking to you about it, the more information they give, the less, right? The less you're interested in. So there's a little bit of a backfire effect. Yes?
Maybe it seems preachy.
Maybe it seems preachy, right? So we looked at kind of a lot of these different things, and the theoretical foundation is a lot of the things that we just heard from our audience here, is that for folks who tend to be less environmentally concerned, and they see these green tips, and they see a lot of them, there's an incongruence, right? This is incongruent with what I believe, incongruent with what I do, and that incongruence over here creates a backfire effect. In many cases where you become entrenched with your existing beliefs. Not something good and not something you want to see happen as an advertiser. They're also generally skeptical about great ads, so you do see from them that they consider many tips to be kind of impractical. And there's also what's called this cover-up effect, which is a fascinating advertising phenomenon, which is, for some folks, the more a company spends, And the more you actually see them advertised, the more skeptical you are about them, that they're trying too hard, like they're just trying too hard, or they're covering up something. So that's a really interesting curve that you see with like advertising and product quality, that too much can actually have a negative effect. So that was the TIPS project, and some interesting implications here as we wrap up this particular project. The number of tips. So you think about you're communicating tips, and it could be in any different context. You have someone who's not as concerned, not as interested. More is not necessarily better. Less might actually be more. There's source, there's message, and there's consumer implication. And I think particularly for tips and the number of tips, targeting, like everything else in marketing, is pause for a second. Do you have any questions before we talk about the next exciting study? Yes?
I do. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about like you mentioned company reputation.
Yeah.
So for instance, Pelicase, I have one. It's a compostable phone case, and so it's something that you might not be as aware of if you're not environmentally concerned.
Yeah.
But if it was like a mainstream company, like I don't know, Coca-Cola or whatever, as a low environmental concern, you might be aware of it. But as a high environmental concern, you might be like, well, this is like they're just big, like. So does that?
That's a great idea. You know, we're going to look at reputation in the next couple of studies and see how that influences responses. Because you're exactly right. Particularly if you have a green reputation, if you're more dominant reputation, it changes the way people think about it. That's very true. Other thoughts? Questions? All right, so we're going to talk in this next study about what Matthew and Ray, so this is a project with Ray, who's also on the marketing faculty, about arrogance. So when you think about an arrogant person, what do you think about? Think about someone who's arrogant. What are the things that come to mind? Yes?
Like they only think they're right and they are not really open to other people.
Yeah, they're not open to other people. They don't think they're right. What else do you think about? About arrogance. Think of an arrogant person. Do you have a favorable impression of that person? I see some people nodding their head. No. Care to share anything about that? What do you think about them?
I mean, it typically just seems like they're like flaunting whatever it is that they're doing well. Typically.
Yeah, they're kind of flaunting it.
And that just rubs people the wrong way.
It can rub some people the wrong way, right? Yes, what do you think, Grace?
It's just not someone that I really would choose to be around if I had.
Not something you'd want to be around, right? What do you think, Sarah?
I also think it makes a person less credible because you're less likely to listen to what they have to say.
Yeah, so it could make a person less credible. So one of the things we thought about is arrogance, right, doesn't really have any positive associations. People think very negatively about it. There's a lot of stuff in the management literature, which I don't know as well as my great management colleagues, but it talks a lot about, you know, how arrogance from a leadership perspective can really be demotivating for teams and really has a negative impact on team behavior. So we started to think about, well, what happens when a company is actually arrogant, and particularly arrogant about their green advertising or their green contributions? Is there a place where arrogance might actually work? So interesting about the green advertising space is there's what's called this information asymmetry, where a company knows more and infinitely more about what it's actually doing than the consumer does. Do you have any poker players here? Anybody who likes to play poker? A couple folks maybe? Right, so when you play poker, you have a hand, you know more about your cards than anybody else. There's some asymmetry there. There's also asymmetry in a lot of other contexts. How many folks have bought a used car? How many folks liked buying a used car? Most folks would say no. Why don't you like buying a used car?
You don't know what you're getting.
You don't know what you're getting, right? Whoever that seller is, whoever's owned that car, knows infinitely more about the car than you do. So there's this information asymmetry. When you go to stay at an Airbnb, for example, the host knows infinitely more about the nuts and bolts of that particular Airbnb than you do. So you have to look for certain cues, or as an advertiser or as a host, you have to send certain cues to establish credibility. So we're going to look at a couple of listings here and how you signal credibility. I'm from Wichita, Kansas, so I was just looking this up and found this really nice listing, La Casita, home away from home, entire home in Wichita, Kansas, hosted by Ms. with two Z's, Lopez. So got some pictures there. How many folks, when you look at this particular listing, would say, I'm in. I'm going to stay at this particular Airbnb? Folks, yes. Anybody hesitant to stay at this one? You have one. Yeah, why are you hesitant?
Looks like a shady lot.
Yeah, looks like a little bit of a shady lot. It's brand new construction. They could probably do some landscaping there. What else? What else about this particular one? Yeah, what do you think?
I'm seeing a lot of typos in the description, so I don't know if I would necessarily trust the person who's offering.
So attention to detail might not be the strength, and that might lead you to infer certain things. What is missing from this that would be helpful for you to decide if you actually wanted to stay at this place? What do you think, Spencer? Customer reviews, right? What does it say here? It's a new listing. When you see a new listing on Airbnb, for those folks who travel, how many folks does it give you a moment of pause? You're like, do I want to be the first one to go in there? I see a lot of folks nodding their heads. Why is that? Why is that? Great pictures, right? Ms. Lopez, after all, right? Why? What do you think?
The same thing he said of
Yeah.
you don't know what you're getting because no one else has tried it before you.
You don't know what you're getting. You don't really have a whole lot of diagnostic information. There's a ton of information and symmetry. So what if it looked like this? Same home. They have some more information. Guest favorite. Not Miss Lopez. She's gone. We've got Allie here. She's a super host. Top 5% of homes. How many folks would say, I'm in now? I'll sign up for this. So what changed for you? What changed? Yes?
I see there's like 98 reviews and 4.98 stars who have like the trust that people have stayed there before and they've had like a positive experience.
Yeah, so these reviews help to build some trust. What else?
Yeah, I feel like the credibility and trust is what changed.
Yes, credibility and trust would change. So these are all different signals that this particular host has sent through this particular listing to help enhance credibility and trust. When you think about it, so this is the actual listing for that second post. It's a really nice place in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. What are the different credibility signals that you see just in this really small space that help to establish that this is a pretty viable, pretty good listing that I probably want to stay? What are some of the signals? Yeah, what do you think?
It says that she's like a super host, and also it's like in the top. I actually can't read that, but like top something % of homes.
Yeah. So superhost. When you think superhost, what do you think?
Super credible.
Super credible. They do this a lot, right? Like a brand that's pretty dominant in a particular space. They probably do this a lot. Probably have a lot of experience in this. What else do you see? It's a credibility signal. Guest favorite, right? So it's a guest favorite.
4.98.
Endorsed 4.98. What else? What do you see on the bottom right there? It's a rare find. Like all of these different marketing signals say, this is a find. You got to book this now. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on this chance. When you think about it, advertisers send signals all the time. And those signals come in a lot of different forms. They come in awards and accolades that helps establish whether it's a speaker or whether it's a company. Like, we won this award for being great. We won this award for diversity and inclusion, right? We won this award for a lot of different things that helps us establish credibility. Certification, right? B Corp, certified B Corp, non-GMO certified. Like all of those things help to nudge you in the direction to say, okay, don't believe us, but there's this signal here that's showing that we actually have this. Or partnerships. Nature Valley partners with the national parks. So why do we think Nature Valley is being green? Well, we have this formidable partnership with the National Park Service. So one of the things that we thought about as we were constructing this project, think about arrogance, is are there certain brands or certain signals that a brand sends that may make, when we make an arrogant message, a little bit more viable? And when you think about brands, much like you think about a superhost, like a superhost has done a lot of this stuff, Ms. Lopez, not so much, right? Brands across the spectrum, some are more dominant than others. And you think about when you go into the grocery store and anytime you walk down an aisle and you see an array of a particular brand, it's a signal that it's dominant in that particular space. When you go into the laundry aisle, you see a ton of orange. Like, well, Tide must be the market leader. That's a credibility signal. It's constantly to imitate. When you think about this ad, it's got to be Tide, right? That's sending the signal that we are a credible enterprise. And then other cues that use to be diagnostic, like the #1 most trusted brand. So we started to think about that nexus between, for a green ad, you have a dominant brand and you have you have this arrogant message. Does that nexus actually help establish credibility? So you think about an arrogant appeal, it's something that asserts its superiority over others and generally has very negative associations. This is an example of a comparative ad that I thought was pretty fun. When you think about from BMW, right? Congratulations to Audi for winning the South African Car of the Year award in 2006 from the winner of the World Car of the Year. That's a form of comparative advertising, right? It's asserting kind of its superiority. So what we did is we did a couple of studies. I'm going to show you quickly a couple highlights related to them. Is we designed kind of these arrogant ads. Now, there's a whole question about whether a company can actually say it, but I think there's some implications here about how consumers link certain things that is super fascinating, right? We know sustainability better than anyone. Versus you see this non-arrogant or humble message over here, we continue to learn about it, right? Most folks would say the humble message would win every day and probably twice on Sundays, right? People tend to gravitate more towards humility. But what we actually found is that this kind of arrogant message over here is that when it comes from a brand that's perceived to be dominant, a high market share within that particular category, it actually enhances or elevates the perceived credibility and also how you feel about that particular brand. So this kind of arrogant message over here actually does improve perceptions of credibility, which is super interesting. The humble appeal, there's not that relationship with the source, but it happens with this more dominant source. So we did another study. We actually have several others that are related to this, but I thought these kind of got to the point about what the study showed, is you have this one that says, we're greener than all other juice companies, and we do more to stop packaging waste than anyone, right? Kind of arrogant, pretty arrogant, some would say, versus a non-arrogant message. Again, when you look at the far right of this screen, in this kind of arrogant message, the dark shaded box is the more dominant brand, perceived to be higher market share in that particular arena. So that enhances perceptions of credibility, which is interesting that consumers are making this potential connection. So if you think about it, right, from an advertising perspective, there are a lot of regulations that would say, you know, there are certain things you can't say, and adopting this kind of arrogant approach. But the fact that consumers make this kid action is super interesting, right? That when you see a more dominant brand and they have an arrogant message, in the absence of any other information, in the absence of any what you call reasons to believe or any other facts, they're automatically saying that this is more credible. So it's interesting when you think about that relationship. When you go shopping or you look at ads, you think about how a dominant brand versus a less dominant brand can influence your perceptions. I think it's really interesting. So one of the big findings from here is that arrogance can actually work in certain situations. There are certain places where arrogance might actually be effective. So the last piece of our puzzle today is we're going to bring all three of those different aspects together. We'll look at the source, we'll look at the message, we're also going to look at individual receiver characteristics. And we're going to look at through the lens of an ad. So most of my research is really inspired by real ads. This was an ad on the left side that was in Europe for a time, which was encouraging consumers to say, don't buy us, Coca-Cola, if you you won't recycle the bottle, right? It's what's called an assertive message. It's providing some direction to consumers and asserting what you want them to do. In this case, we don't want you to buy it if you're not actually going to recycle. A really interesting sustainability campaign. And what research on this kind of assertive messaging has found before is that if you're on that low environmental concern end of the spectrum, you gotta tone it down. You gotta bring it down. That assertive message backfires in a big way and it doesn't resonate with them at all. So you gotta tone it down, be a lot less assertive. So my colleagues and I asked, we said, well, wait a second. Is there a way to preserve the assertive tone, but preface it with something that will lead folks into a greater reception to the exact same message? And that concept is called the message framing. So I do a lot of work on how you frame certain messages, which is about bringing something to the foreground and putting something else in the background. You see a lot of message framing when you look at sports. I've used some of these examples in the past. The same event you can frame in two different ways. I used this in my market research class last semester, where you think about this game from Notre Dame. It was Notre Dame versus Northern Illinois, a huge upset in South Bend in the college football world. No one expected Northern Illinois to win, and lo and behold, they did. And if you look about how this message was framed, on the top left over here is the Notre Dame website. So it's really subdued. Notre Dame falls to Northern Illinois 14 to 16, right? Let's get in and let's get out. Let's not make a big deal about this at all. And on the bottom right was actually the Northern Illinois website, right? Huskies stunned, right? Stunned, it's a more powerful word. 5th ranked. Notice Notre Dame didn't say 5th ranked over here. We kind of downplay that, right? We wanted to frame as Northern Illinois that this was a magnificent victory in South Bend over the 5th ranked team. And for Notre Dame, we wanted to frame it as a really close game, just didn't quite pull up. So I went to this game a few weeks ago, and I think one of the best Villanova basketball games I've been to in my time here. But another example of that, you have the Villanova website, and you have the UConn website, and how you frame a certain event in different ways, depending on who your audience is. So there's a ton of research that shows how very subtle changes influence how people respond to certain things. So there are these frames, for example, like the gain versus loss frame. When you save, you can gain and see your family's money grow. When you do not save, you can't earn interest and see your family's money grow, or you'll lose out on the opportunity. A ton of research shows that people are much more responsive to losses. Like losses really get people fired up. There's other frames like promotion versus prevention, where you change a couple of words here. You can obtain positive results, you can avoid negative results, and it significantly affects how you would respond to that exact same message and potentially take action. Whether you actually put the percentage of how much you're donating versus a more ambiguous term. So I've done a lot of the stuff related to message framing, and as Jonathan mentioned at the outset, one of the projects I looked at was with Dave's Killer Bread. It's one of my early projects where Dave's Killer Bread is a purpose-oriented brand. They hire ex-offenders, but that tends to be very controversial in the public sphere. So they were interested in how do we promote this particular message, but make it a little bit more palatable. And the idea is that if you put something in front of it, called a cultural identity mindset, so if you can change people's mindset to think about yourself as having a fresh start. Fresh starts are universally well received. Like there's a lot of positive connotation with that. Just by inserting that in a social media post or a lot of different tests we did, significantly changed the trajectory of how they responded to this ex-offenders campaign. Dave's Killer Bread launched the campaign. It was one of the most successful ones that they've ever done just by having this particular message frame. So we thought about that with this Coca-Cola ad, how that inspired this study. So we said, well, wait a second. If you keep the same message, so don't buy our water if you won't recycle the bottle, right? It's a derivative of the Coke ad. But you precede it with what's called an alter cast, right? You cast the target audience into a more positive role, into an aspirational role in something that will make them a little bit more receptive to it. So we use this AlterCast frame across some different studies. There's a lot that's going on here, but I do want to just clear like one of the big ideas that came out of this, or one of the big findings. So when a brand is more dominant, high market share versus low market share, and the consumer tends to be less concerned about the environment. You have a high market share brand, you have a consumer who's less concerned about the environment, the AlterCast frame essentially works. And it works better for those folks in terms of how they feel about that particular source. We did this again, so this is a second study related to, and another driven on it with, using Colgate as the brand. So a high market share dominant brand with this same frame. So you are a responsible consumer. The only difference, half the group saw this, the other half saw the other one. And what we saw again is for folks who tend to be less concerned about the environment, they're much more responsive when you put that frame up front, and their behavioral intentions to actually follow through with it go up significantly. So by saying or casting someone that you are a responsible consumer, it changes the way they think about that subsequent assertive message. So a couple takeaways from this, and then I'll wrap up some big takeaways from our discussion today, is that assertiveness and brand dominance with this study is very risky business. It's a bad combination. A really assertive message from really dominant source. So one of the ways to do that is to create a frame to help make consumers more receptive, which is what you see there. And we've also seen over the course of our chat today that low environmental consumers, there are certain ways to nudge them in a more sustainable direction. Simple things like the frame that you put at the top with an AlterCast. Simple things like thinking about the number of tips or the amount of information you provide can make a significant difference on how they will receive it. So I'll give you a quick peek under the tent for some works in progress here. I'll give you my 3 takeaways from the session today, and certainly take any questions you have. But there's a couple projects that we have in process now. One relates to the use of questions in advertising, and the use of rhetorical questions and different types of rhetorical questions. We have some fascinating results that a really small change in the way you word a question, once again, influences how someone will receive that particular message. Do some other stuff related to brand purpose, a later stage project, and how do companies that don't have a reputation actually build credibility. There are certain ways they can show about what they've done to make that credibility gap a lot lower. And then a project that is fun for us, it's also kind of fun by nature, is just looking at how to make advertising, particularly green advertising, more fun, and how that will resonate with folks. We're coming off a Super Bowl where frankly some of the ads weren't as great as they have been in the past. I think a lot of it is just making advertising fun again. And how do you make certain things fun? And what are the places, times and places to make green advertising fun, particularly for folks who might be less engaged in the topic. So 3 things that I hope you took away from today. Hope you learned some stuff in the process. But a couple, three things that I wanted to make sure we covered today were the whole idea of how a message source influences ad resonance. You think about the level of perceived dominance of that particular brand in the marketplace has a significant effect. Subtle changes in words and phrases, the number of tips, adding an appeal here, adding a frame up top, makes a huge difference. It can make a huge difference in how people respond. And then the receiver characteristics. So if you're talking to someone who's higher versus lower environmental concern, the messaging strategy should be very different because they will respond to those ads in very different ways. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. Like I said, I hope you learned something. Hope we had a little fun in the process. Special thank you to several folks who were here. Strategic Initiative for Climate Justice and Sustainability, who helped put on this session, the Falvey Library, Also like to thank the Villanova School of Business, Jonathan Doe, my department, the marketing department, for their continued support of the work that I do, the research that I do, and certainly my co-authors in these projects as well. Wouldn't be here without them. We've had a lot of fun developing these studies, and certainly appreciate all of their work and engagement with these projects. So I'll pause for a minute. I thank everybody for coming. We'll take a couple questions, and then we'll wrap up here right before the top of the hour. Yes.
So the main one that's counterintuitive to me is the dominant brand being the one that benefits the most from the air conditioning.
Yeah.
I would think if I see a dominant brand
Yeah.
trying to make themselves out to be really environmental, I would think like you're just saying that, but that's not your identity. If it's some mom and pop, I'm going to be like, oh, that's probably why they founded the company.
Yes,
Not,
yes.
This is what they do.
Yeah.
So what do you think about?
So there's a certain element there which I didn't get into, but there's a lot of layers there where people just assume that that brand has earned it, right? That because they're more dominant in the marketplace, they're perceived to have accrued that over time, they've earned the right essentially to be area, and that message is actually credible because of where they are in the marketplace. And I think when you think about it at that level, it was counterintuitive for us at first, but that kind of makes sense, right? That if you think about any company that you interact with, you go to the grocery store and they make a product claim, and if they're dominant, probably more likely to think it's credible because of the presence that they have within the marketplace, even without any other pieces of information. Yes, in the back.
I had a question about the way, actually I have two things.
Yeah.
One is, how did you measure or quantify environmental concern? Can you say a little bit more about that?
So there's an established scale to measure environmental concern that has 5 different items. And those items, and we create an index because they're all correlated with each other. But the items generally reflect the idea of like, I am concerned about the state of the environment, right? I am concerned about the future of the environment. So it's related to kind of their overall perspective or perception of kind of the environmental affairs. And you do see pretty good distribution across that scale from low to high. Can I answer your question?
And is that, so it's a continuous variable?
It's a continuous variable,
So
yeah.
did you get a lot of, you showed us those trend lines, but
Yeah.
did you get a lot of variation for any given environmental concern in terms of the authenticity?
We did.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, I mean, particularly with environmental concern, you don't, frankly, have a ton of folks who say 1 or 2, but across the distribution of the scale, you do see pretty good variance, which is exactly what you'd want to see, right?
Yeah.
And so with that, we're able to then look at environmental concern across multiple levels on that scale.
And then you had the best fit line then.
And that's the best fit line, yeah.
So another question, I wanted to go back, and this was more a general theme
Yeah.
that you gave at the beginning that I'm just curious about, and that is the activism piece.
Yes.
And what you think, and I think has already happened recently, but what you think will happen in advertising going forward. I'm thinking about companies, for instance, that touted DEI.
Yeah, that's right. So what's interesting about the activism piece, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that because our focus today was green advertising, but what's interesting about the activism piece is that when companies take on a socio-political issue, inherently it's controversial, inherently there will be backlash, right? But the interesting part of that is that the knee-jerk response, whether you're an influencer, whether you're a leader, whether you're a CEO, whether you're a company, is once that backlash happens to actually retract it and say like, no, we're going to take that ad off the air, we're going to remove that statement, we're going to stop doing this, whatever. What we've actually found is that is the least optimal response. That is the worst thing that a company can do, because what happens is now the people who were initially upset, they're still upset, and the people who were on board with you have now moved over here and are also upset. So you've created now 2 camps who are equally angry, whereas saying nothing at all is actually better. Or just saying, taking responsibility without, and acknowledging the backlash without retracting something performs a lot better. So I think what we've seen in the activism space is that why companies have become more reticent is they've actually just mishandled the backlash that's come in. Because with any issue, there's always going to be some backlash, and when you mishandle it, it multiplies kind of the negative effect.
Yeah, thank you.
So you're welcome. Thanks for coming. Yes.
Very big question.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I've learned so much.
Oh, good.
So how is it possible to, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a scientist at all, is it possible to measure how much green ads can move low concern consumers? Is there even a way of doing that? I put that out there because I know nothing about it.
There's a ton of things that you can do to actually measure
Like as impact.
and add impact, right? And there are some studies that actually track, from an individual's attitude all the way through to they follow through to behavior. So there's some really interesting stuff. It's harder to ultimately get at that stuff, but there is a lot of research that has shown that, particularly if you have certain behavioral intentions, the likelihood of following through is much, much better than if it's just kind of an attitudinal output. So, yeah, but there's a lot of cool stuff now for the marketing, in the marketing science world, about being able to track consumers, whether it's green ads or any other ad, and what that subsequent behavior looks like. So,
Thank you.
special thanks to all my former students who are here. Fantastic to see everybody. I know you got some extra credit, but I'll just pretend you wanted to come see me, but I appreciate it. Happy to see you all anytime. Thank you for coming. Have a great afternoon.
Very accessible.
Making my
Oh, part 4, not part 5. Oh, I got over there. I was actually the last one.
so sad.
I think your name is. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. That's very cool. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Earl, nice to see you. Every time I pass by McDonald's, I think of you in
I hope I put it on the calendar.
In a while.
Oh, we actually haven't. Hey, Barney, see you later.
What about your Oreos? Your Oreos are pretty well standing low.
Oh, man, this is dire.
We're running low.
No cookie toast pie, Jake. No Oreos? Bad news.
Maybe it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, 'cause
Oh, wow.
Either way, I don't know.
yeah, March.
Oh, March 14th.
Oh,
You had the right day.
yeah.
Yeah, 14th.
Yes. So,
I saw. I can pull
Got
it
it
into the management
pretty
literature.
close.
It's all management, like
Yeah.
literally all the theory, all the theories
Yeah.
are.
And I was just
I'm
thinking,
gonna tell them that.
this is so heavy.
Do you need help?
Crazy.
Do you want me to carry your
No,
bag?
no. Once you get it on your back, it's okay.
Fine.
I was gonna say the stuff about power, like Jeffrey Pfeffer.
Hi, Megan. How are you? Wow, very nice. Thank you.
We're gonna have to pull you to the management literature.
Yes.
Yes, and you know it.
You're very close.
Fine, thanks for coming.
Great.
That was like the second best game of the year.
I know. I really wanted to.
Rick Pitino's coming to town. Yeah, I know. It's even ever the more reason to go.
Maybe I'll cancel.
Your check out. I don't want them to put. You're not.
Well, it's a 49% chance. That's in my office.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna lose today, and then
There's always a little bit. I think if there's no NCAA tournament this year, I think she's fresh. After 3 years. I added an example last semester to illustrate standard deviation. I used the Villanova basketball last 3 years as an example, right? Because let's must not be best. I would have taken that, right? Like, let's